email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or news.
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett.
I'm joined today by Adam Mendler, CEO of the Veloz Group, where he oversees ventures across a wide variety of industries such as Beverly Hills Chairs, custom tobacco, and Veloz Solutions. He's the host of the business and leadership podcast, 30-Minute Mentors. On top of that, Adam is a prolific writer, having written more than 70 articles on leadership and related topics in major media outlets including Forbes, HuffPost, and more. And if that's not enough, he also teaches a course on leadership and teamwork at UCLA, sits on influential boards at both UCLA and USC, and is an avid sports fan. We'll get into all that and more, but first, Adam, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm exhausted just reading your bio. I don't know how you do it all. You've had such a diverse career and have experienced working in a number of different industries. Could you just briefly walk us through your journey as an entrepreneur and how you got to where you are today as a leader?
Wow. Well, I thought we were going to spend the half hour just talking about sports. That was what I was excited about talking about.
That's coming.
We can talk about my career. We can talk about leadership, but you really want to get me excited. Let's talk about baseball.
We got some questions on baseball coming.
Great. I can't wait. That's the part that I'm fired up about. Just don't ask me about the Angels because it's been a rough couple of years for us. And when I say couple, rounding down my career. So I went down the traditional path. I did my undergrad at USC. After college, I took a job for a hedge fund. They were actually the biggest hedge fund in the world at the time, a company called D.E. Shaw, and worked there for a couple of years. Then got my MBA at UCLA. While I was in business school, I worked in the entertainment industry, worked for a big talent agency, worked for a big studio. And then when I graduated from business school, went back into the world of finance, worked for a big bank, Credit Suisse, for about a year and a half. And at that point, I was in my late 20s and had all this corporate experience and sort of reached this crossroads where I felt like if I was ever going to do anything entrepreneurial, it was the right time in my life. It was the right time in my journey to take that leap. My energy was never going to be higher. My expenses were never going to be lower. I was ready to make an impact, and I was ready to do something that I thought I could more readily do as an entrepreneur. And over the last, it's crazy to say this, but it's been a decade now. As an entrepreneur, I've built a few different businesses, have had a lot of highs, have had a lot of lows, like all entrepreneurs do. Many failures, many lessons learned, but somehow, Clint, I'm here on this podcast with you to talk about all of it.
That's great. I appreciate that. So you're an intentional entrepreneur, which is always interesting. I'm an accidental entrepreneur, which is a little bit different.
Well, it's funny you say that. I consider myself an accidental entrepreneur because I didn't grow up aspiring to be an entrepreneur. I didn't grow up dreaming to be an entrepreneur. I grew up dreaming to run a baseball team. When I was 7 years old, my dream was to be the general manager of the Angels. And that was really my aspiration all the way through college, all the way going into business school. And at that point, I had a little bit of a pivot. I, for a variety of reasons, decided to shift focus and shift my focus from wanting to run a baseball team to wanting to pursue a career in the world of entertainment. But I know we only have 30 minutes to talk about it, but somehow along the way, life takes you in different directions. And in my late 20s, I sort of took a step back and asked myself, where am I in my life? Where am I in my career? And am I doing what I want to do? Am I doing what I'm really meant to do? And at that point, I started the Veloz Group, the business that, as we spoke about off the air, named after the street I grew up on. And my path to becoming an entrepreneur was not necessarily an intentional path. And the reality is that when you look around, Clint, your path, my path, anyone listening who's an entrepreneur, we all may have different journeys to getting to where we are. But once you are an entrepreneur, man, it's game on.
It's funny because my dad was a serial entrepreneur, he was intentional. He started business after business after business. And so I watched him, and a lot of them failed. And I watched him and I thought, I want to punch a clock. I don't want to be an entrepreneur. And I knew I wanted to be an engineer since I was about 8 years old. So I would check out books on robotics and lasers in the library. And that was always my aspiration. And that's how I ended up at Georgia Tech getting a double E degree. And then somehow ended up becoming an entrepreneur along the way and running a project management firm, which was definitely not intentional, but I think it ended up being probably my life's calling. So, like I was reading books on robotics and lasers early in your career, you did something similar where you picked the thing that you thought was going to help you. And I read that you befriended a sports agent who became an influential person in your professional life. Can you tell us more about this mentor of yours and how he impacted your career? And more generally, talk about the importance of good mentors, especially early in your career.
Yeah, so I love talking about mentorship. It's a topic that I'm extremely passionate about. My podcast is called 30-Minute Mentors. So this is a topic near and dear to my heart. When I was a kid, I developed a relationship with, to me, he was just a great guy. But as I became a little bit older, I came to learn that he was and is one of the top sports agents in Major League Baseball. And a friendship turned into a mentorship relationship. And, as I've come to learn over the years, the best mentor-mentee relationships are just that. They're friendships. They're relationships that start off in organic ways. You can't really force someone to mentor you. You can't walk up to someone and say, "Will you be my mentor?" It has to happen organically. You can try to position yourself in a way to develop great relationships with people. You can reach out to people and hope to build and cultivate relationships with them. In this case, it happened organically. He is a family friend. His son was actually, I want to say, classmates with my sister. But when I say classmates, they were in preschool together. So this was a relationship starting at a very young age and has remained extremely strong until today. And what started off really around a shared love of baseball evolved into a friendship and a mentor-mentee relationship that transcended the passion for baseball, where he's provided me with so much great advice about life, about my career, business advice. And that's really what a mentor-mentee relationship should be about. And, on my podcast, I bring on what I believe are the best network of mentors possible, people who are Fortune 500 CEOs, founders of household name companies, well-known celebrities, Hall of Fame athletes, retired generals and admirals. And the concept of the show isn't to spend 30 minutes talking about mentorship, but rather to give listeners access to people who could mentor them for 30 minutes. And something that I believe very strongly in is it's great to have what I have had, which is a great mentor, but it's also important to have what I call mini mentors, people who you might connect with once, or you might connect with once a year, or once every few years. And that interaction could be a game changer to you. It could be a game changer to your life, could be a game changer to your career. And sometimes you don't even need to connect with them directly. It could be listening to a podcast. It could be reading a book. I've had guests on my podcast who have spoken about mentors they've had in their lives who they've never met. I had a Emmy Award-winning broadcaster who told me that the biggest mentor in her life is Oprah Winfrey. She's never met Oprah, but she's consumed all of Oprah's content. So it's important for anyone listening to this conversation to understand mentorship through a broader lens, to try to rethink mentorship, and to be open-minded in terms of how you receive mentorship, but to understand that mentorship is integral to success. You're never going to get there alone. And to really make it not only to the top, but to attain really any level of success, you need to have the help of those around you, those who've been there, those who can help you in any shape, form, or fashion.
Now, as we record this, we are, fingers crossed, hopefully, in the latter stages of a pandemic. And during these past couple of years, of course, work from home has become the norm. With many companies offering their teams the opportunity to continue working remotely even as offices reopen, what is the impact on mentorship for remote employees? I know I've been particularly concerned with if somebody was a new employee that was hired during the pandemic, they've never met their coworkers in person, only can observe them on video calls. What impact do you, first of all, think, if any, work from home and mentorship have had on each other? And then secondly, what advice would you give the person that's been with the company for a year and never met any of their teammates and only talked to them occasionally on video calls? How do you identify a mentor? How do you get mentorship in that kind of environment?
The answer is everyone needs to try harder. So mentorship, whether you're meeting in person, whether you're meeting remotely, it's attainable. You just need to try harder. You need to put yourself out there more actively. You need to be more proactive in terms of how you find mentors, how you seek relationships. And again, to build upon an earlier point, it's not a matter of going out and approaching someone and say, will you mentor me? It doesn't work that way. It's a matter of identifying people in your network. It could be people in your company. It could be people who you're connected to. It could be people who you don't know, and it should be people who you don't know, but you might share some common bond with. And there have been so many great stories that I've heard from so many of the most successful leaders in America who have had the opportunity to speak to, who've spoken about how they've developed their best mentor-mentee relationships. And it started by reaching out to a stranger, or it started by reaching out to someone in their network and asking for an introduction to someone who they knew. But the person who they knew, or that stranger, was someone who they had something in common with, a shared interest. In the case of the mentor you asked me about, it was a shared passion for baseball. When we hung out, we would always talk about baseball, and it was an authentic, fun conversation because no matter how much time we had blocked out, we could spend all of that time and more just talking about baseball, and it would be a ton of fun. So you want to try to find someone who you will really enjoy being around. They will really enjoy being around you. It shouldn't be a chore. It shouldn't be a hassle. It shouldn't be a burden. It shouldn't be an obligation for either party. And think about, again, your passions, but also think about what are other commonalities that you and someone that you might be interested in cultivating a relationship with share. And I would just start there, and I wouldn't be afraid. You've got to put yourself out there. So the fact that we're in a pandemic, the fact that we're in a remote work setting, Clint, that's not going to change all that much even when we get out of the pandemic. Even when offices reopen, there's still going to be this virtual component that isn't going to completely go away. I'm a big believer that the hybrid environment is here to stay. I think some companies will really push on going back to the office. I think some companies will remain completely distributed. And I think some companies will really lean into this hybrid model. And my company is hybrid. So, and we have an office furniture business, so we see it firsthand. We're dealing with all kinds of companies all across America. We have a front row seat to how this has been playing out over the last couple of years. So regardless of the climate that we're in, be active. Don't be afraid to reach out. If someone doesn't respond, if someone's too busy, don't let that set you back. Try to go out and find people who are going to be able to make an impact in your life, and try to find people who you will enjoy being around and they will enjoy being around you.
Right. So if this hybrid environment is here to stay, which I agree with you, it probably is, as a leader, it's even more important that we be effective in our communication when we're not all face to face, right? Right now, I'm looking at you. I can see you on screen. I could see if you were shaking your head or nodding, even though it's nonverbal. And we lose some of that when we work remotely. So what are some of the important tools in your leadership toolbox for being effective when it comes to communication, especially in a hybrid environment?
Yeah, Clint, I love this question. And the answer I'm going to give is pretty similar to my previous answer, which is that I don't think that leaders need to rewrite the playbook, but I do think that leaders need to really reach into the playbook and more actively follow it. I think that leaders need to more closely stick to the best practices. And what do I mean by that? You need to be more proactive in your communication. You aren't going to see people every day. So a lot of the things that we take for granted when we're communicating with people in person are all of a sudden off the table in a virtual setting. So you need to be more proactive. You need to be more frequent in your communication. When you have employees who are in, I was going to say different parts of the world as I do, but they could even be in different parts of the city, but you're not seeing them. Go out of your way every day to check in on them, to talk to them, to see how they're doing. And anything you would do if you were leading in real life, do the same thing, but do it virtually.
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes, I think, by George Bernard Shaw was, "The single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place." And so, we think we've communicated, but maybe we haven't. And I was wondering if in your career, have you seen a situation where you thought it was clear communication, but it wasn't received properly, or it was received in a way differently than you intended it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I feel like there are a lot of different times when that's happened in my life, a lot of different times when that's happened in my career. When you ask that question, it's taking me back all the way to my early days as a student, communicating with my teachers, and just feeling like you're sitting in the classroom and you're trying to express something, and you don't understand why your teacher sees it in a different way than you see it. And then as you enter into the workforce and you try to communicate something a certain way, and you don't understand why your boss doesn't see it the way that you see it. And then as a leader, you communicate something. And the biggest takeaway to me is that as a leader, you really need to put yourself in the other person's shoes. You really need to understand that we don't all think alike. We don't all come from the same place. We don't all have the same worldview. We don't all have the same perspective. And number one, the more willing you are to accept the fact that we all come from different places, we all think differently. And number two, the more willing you are to adapt and shift your thinking to accommodate the other person's perspective, the more successful you'll be as a communicator, the more successful you'll be as a leader. So it really starts there. It really starts with being willing to listen proactively, asking questions. So many people think of leadership as walking into a room and giving orders. We were talking off the air about your experience in the Navy, and I've interviewed so many military leaders, generals, admirals, and I did an interview with an admiral, not on my podcast, but in a different interview series. And one of the things he told me is, I can count on my hand the number of times in my career that someone's told me, this is an order. And we often think of leaders as people who bark orders, give commands. That's not true. That isn't the way it works in the military. That isn't the way it works in corporate America among the most successful leaders. That isn't the way it works in any context when you really study the best leaders. The best leaders are the best listeners. The best leaders ask the best questions. The best leaders have the humility to understand that they don't know it all, and they want to know it all. And the only way they are going to know it all is by listening and by surrounding themselves with people who think differently than they do, who can offer different perspectives, and by absorbing those perspectives, and then by making informed decisions that are educated by the best information that they could possibly take in. So hopefully that helps provide some context to the way that I try to approach this.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I look at communication, and I think two of the things you mentioned several times in your answer that people tend to gloss over. One is you have to listen. Sometimes, as you said, communication feels like people define it as barking orders, but in reality, it's a lot of listening. And the ratio I like to use is you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. You should use them in that ratio, right? So you should listen more than you talk. And I think the other thing you said a couple times that really resonates with me is you have to be willing to take that other person's opinion and give it some thought. I mean, if I'm never going to change my mind about something, then we're not really going to have a conversation. But if you can influence the way I think about something, if you can influence how I feel, if I can look at your perspective and think, okay, I can see that, then now we have common ground for a conversation. And I think that's probably missing a lot today, unfortunately, in our different environments we work in.
Couldn't agree with you more.
You've taken on a number of endeavors in your career, from sports entertainment to cigars, which I found interesting, and office chairs. And at least a couple of those projects you've worked with a co-founder. And just talk a little bit about your experience collaborating with others to start a business and sharing the advice you have picked up along the way. Because in my perspective, I like having a single point of contact, and having co-founders would seem to add some complexity to the situation, but you've clearly done it well. So what's some advice you have?
To really dive into your point about having a single point of contact, one of the most important things you can do is have a clear division of labor and have a co-founder who has a different set of skills than you do. So in my case, with my brother, we've co-founded a number of businesses together, and our office furniture company, Beverly Hills Chairs, the cigar company you mentioned, Custom Tobacco, our software development company, Veloz Solutions. Those are 3 businesses that my brother and I started together, and we have very, very different skills. Our skills don't really overlap. So when it comes to division of labor, when it comes to who's in charge of what, when it comes to who to communicate with on what issue, it's pretty clear. So try to find people who complement you. And I think that advice is pertinent universally. It transcends entrepreneurship. It transcends transcends who you're trying to figure out who to start a company with. I'm a big believer in general that most people in life are bad at most things. I know that I personally am bad at too many things to list. I don't know how much time we have left in this conversation, but it's not enough time for me to list.
Well, from what I read, you're bad at hitting the curveball and bad at hitting the fastball. So I know those are 2 things you said you're bad at.
And I can't hit a slider. I can't hit a knuckleball. I can't hit a splitter. We can go on and on and on. And the reality is, if we had to go through everything I'm bad at, we don't have anywhere near enough time in this conversation. We don't have anywhere near enough time in the day, maybe even in the week, to go through that list. But we all have a few things that we're good at. We all have that one thing that we're great at. And it's critical to figure out what it is that you're great at, what makes you unique, what makes you special, and find people who can complement what makes you great. Find people who can complement you. And when you're starting a business, find a co-founder or find multiple co-founders who can complement you. Or if you're hiring a team, hire people around you who can complement you. So in the case of my brother, we have very different skills, but the 2 of us do not make a complete team. So we hire other people around us who complement both of us. And you have to do that to be successful in any business.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier about the chair company, Beverly Hills Chairs, and I was curious, has the pandemic affected that business? Have you had to pivot at all, or people just had to buy chairs to work from home now?
Oh yeah, it's been impacted tremendously by the pandemic. And one way it's been impacted is exactly to your point. Prior to the pandemic, most of our business came from small to medium-sized businesses. We've sold over the years to a number of well-known big brand name companies. We sold to some pretty big governmental agencies. The U.S. Senate has bought chairs from us, but our core customer has really been small to medium-sized business owners. And when the pandemic hit, that entire market went away. So we had to pivot overnight to the home office market. And that's where we've really been living in the last couple of years, selling to individuals all across America, buying one chair, maybe 2 chairs, but really 1 chair for their home office. We're starting to see offices buy from us, but those office orders for the last couple of years have been extremely quiet. And it's impacted our business in a number of different ways. We've had to massively expand our warehouse operation, our customer service operation. It's been a challenge for us, but what you have to do when you're running any business is you have to pivot. You can't pretend like things aren't happening. You can't ignore changes. When you're an entrepreneur, the one certainty that you have is uncertainty. You know that change is inevitable. So as a leader, you need to be comfortable with change. You need to have a mindset that is not only supportive, but really encouraging of flexibility. And the leaders who are most adaptive are the leaders who are most successful. The entrepreneurs who are most adaptable are the entrepreneurs who are most successful. So we've had to adapt, we've had to adjust, but it's been, if nothing else, a great learning experience.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of times 30-Minute Mentors, your podcast you've been hosting since 2020, early in 2020. And over that 2 years, you've interviewed some pretty substantial people like athletes like Ricky Williams and Kenny Lofton. And of course, my personal favorite was Mark Teixeira because he went to Georgia Tech like I did. And then, of course, as you mentioned, you also interviewed some CEOs like of Gap and Best Buy, Beachbody, and so many others. And on the podcast, you always ask the question, what can anyone listening do to become more successful personally and professionally? And so I look at you as a successful business leader, a successful podcaster, a successful entrepreneur, and I'm going to ask you the same question. How would you answer that?
I love that question. And it's a question I ask, and I had a guest who I interviewed recently who responded to that question with, kind of joked with me. He's like, wow, that's a pretty broad question. And I said, well, that's why I ask it, so that you can take it in whatever direction you want to take it. And I kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier, but again, I'm a big believer that most people in life are bad at most things. We're all good at a few things, and we all have that one thing that makes us special. It's our superpower. And the more quickly you can figure out what it is that makes you special, the more successful you'll be in life, the more successful you'll be in business, the more successful you'll be as a leader. So I would encourage anyone listening to this conversation to get on that journey. Get on the journey of self-discovery. Before you can effectively lead others, you need to be able to lead your own life. And it starts with understanding what it is about you that makes you special, understanding your superpower. Once you know that, you're going to be on a path to success. Until you know that, you're going to be struggling to really understand how to get there. You might think you're there, but you're not going to be there until you're fully comfortable in your own skin, until you're fully able to be the best version of yourself. So if I had to tell you one thing, it would be that. Lean into it. It's a journey. It's not something that you can figure out overnight. I teach a class at UCLA, and the first week of class, I give students a homework assignment, and this is the homework assignment I give them. I tell them, come back to me next week and tell me what your superpower is. And it's a trick question because you can't figure this out in a week. You can't figure this out in a month. You can't figure this out over the course of a class. It's really a lifelong homework assignment, but you could start it today, tomorrow, make a dent, get on that journey, and you'll be more successful.
That's a great answer. I would expect that though from you.
I appreciate that.
So have you noticed with your students that you're in your class, do you see any leadership trends that are going to develop? You look at this as the future leaders that are coming through your course. Anything you see that's kind of trending as we move forward?
I'm optimistic. I'm extremely optimistic. I think that the students who I teach are very smart. They're very talented. They're very capable. They're very open to learning. They're students, so they come in with an open mind. I also teach a pretty elite group of students, so I might be a little bit biased in that sense. My students are graduate students at UCLA, so they are, I was going to say the best and the brightest, but when David Halberstam used the word the best and the brightest, the phrase the best and the brightest, he didn't mean it in a complimentary way, but these kids really are impressive. And I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic about the future, and I'm excited. And happy to play whatever small role I can in mentoring these students and providing whatever mentorship I can through my podcast and through whatever other means available to me.
Well, as we wrap this up, let's talk about sports, because I know that's near and dear to your heart. So I really enjoyed the Forbes article you wrote, Why Athletes Win in Sales. And I was curious, what is it about being a competitive athlete that translates so well to the business world, particularly in the sales environment?
Well, I wouldn't know, because I was not a very good athlete, as we spoke about. I've studied athletes. I was a very mediocre high school baseball player. I was the captain of the worst high school baseball team in the history of high school and in the history of baseball, which is quite a distinction, but quite a designation. So, but there are so many things about athletes that make them successful. To just give a couple, the competitiveness and the work ethic, the drive. So what I think we can learn is you don't need to be an athlete to be successful in sales. Clearly, if you are an athlete, you have these built-in advantages. But what's important is that anyone who's a reader or anyone listening to this conversation can draw from those takeaways and can apply those lessons and can say, you know what? Athletes are successful at sales because they're competitive. How can I unleash the competitiveness in me to succeed in sales, to succeed in business, to succeed in life? How can I unleash this work ethic to succeed in becoming the best version of me? That's what I really hope to bring out in that article.
Okay, last but not least, is this the year for your beloved LA Angels?
Absolutely. And I've never been wrong about that.
Hope springs eternal.
I'm joking. I've been wrong about that every year. I've only been right about that once. I was right about it when I said yes. I said the Angels will win the World Series. I predicted that the Angels would win the World Series the year that they won the World Series. I was right. Listeners of this podcast, you might not believe me. I predicted it in 2002. I said the Angels would win the World Series. Now, I've been saying that they would win the World Series for the last 30 years. So I was bound to be right once. But yes, it is their year.
All right. Well, let's hope so. If not the Braves, and I'll root for the Angels.
Hey, you guys had a great run last year. That was amazing.
Oh, yeah, it was. I felt so good for the manager, Snicker, who'd been a career minor league guy. And
I watched the postseason last year very closely. The Braves were, man, what a team. That's an example of you don't have the best players, you don't have the most talent, you don't have the best roster, but you have the best team. You have the best 25. You have the best heart, the players who are playing the best together at the right time. They wanted it the most. That was what it was. They just wanted it, and they took it. They earned it. There was no luck involved. That was just a group of guys going out there, fighting for it, clawing, beating teams that were more talented, beating teams that should have knocked them out in just about every series. And somehow, some way, the Braves looked like the better team. It wasn't the Braves clawing by. It was the Braves really playing better baseball every series. They just wanted it more. And they looked like they belonged. Yeah, it was impressive. That was, as a baseball fan, I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, I think it was, especially with all the late season trades and the people that weren't having great seasons, and all of a sudden they come on board and having great seasons for us. I mean, for the Braves, it was, as a fan, it was a true joy to experience, for sure.
Could only imagine what that must have been like as a Braves fan. I could just tell you, as someone who was rooting against the Dodgers, I enjoyed it. As someone who's rooting against the Astros, I enjoyed it. So can't say I was, doing the tomahawk chop, but I was certainly rooting for the Braves to take down the Dodgers, take down the Astros, and they did. So happy to see it happen.
Braves fan by proxy. We'll take it.
I did watch a lot of TBS growing up. I watched more Braves baseball than any team other than the Angels, by virtue of growing up in LA in an era when
Superstation.
I don't know how old, I don't know the average age of your listeners, but when I grew up, there weren't anywhere near. I mean, we're talking about a fraction of the number of baseball games on TV.
Right.
And the Braves were the team that were on all the time. Other than the Angels and the Dodgers, the team that was on was the Braves. And I would watch tons and tons of Braves games. So I grew up watching those teams. And I still remember that play at the plate, Sid Bream. Man, that was exciting. And talk about the pitching staff, Maddox, Glavine, Smoltz, Avery. And can go around, talk about the roster. We could spend all day talking about Atlanta Braves of the 90s, 2000s. Those are the days, man.
Well, Kenny Lofton, one of your guests on your podcast, was on the team. I think that went to that won the World Series. I think it was Kenny was on that team.
Not the team that I don't believe he was on the team that won the World Series, but he was on the team that went one of the teams that went to the World Series, and he was on the podcast. He spoke a little bit about the difference between playing for the Braves and playing for the Indians. How the Indians clubhouse was like Animal House, and the Braves clubhouse, you could hear a pin drop, but they both worked. And it kind of goes back to leadership. The core principles of leadership are universal. They might manifest themselves in different ways, but fundamentally, to be successful, you need to follow the fundamentals.
Got it. Adam, it's been a pleasure having you on the podcast today. Thanks so much for the conversation.
Pleasure's been mine. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation. To find out more about Clint, go to clintonmpaget.com and pick up Clint's book, How Teams Triumph, Managing by Commitment, at Amazon. The Conversation with Clinton M. Paget is a production of Forbes Books.